The Rhône drifted past Arausio, thick with silt and silent bodies. Roman armor gleaming dully beneath the surface, while broken spears and shields lay half-buried along its banks. On this ground, in the year 105 before Christ, more Roman soldiers had fallen in a single day than at Cannae. Not to Hannibal, but to wandering tribes from the north. 80,000 Romans vanished here because their own leaders chose pride over unity. They had come out of the misty north as a people on the move, not as a band of raiders. Several thousand wagons creaked southward in long columns, piled high with tents, tools, sacred poles, and children who learned to walk in the tracks of the wheels, while warriors marched alongside with shields slung and spears over their shoulders. Around the campfires at night, seers read omens in smoke and storm. And at dawn, the same host that had sung to its gods closed ranks into a wall of shields that broke tribes, towns, and frontier garrisons that stood in its way. Along the ragged edges of Rome's world, the legions met this moving nation and shattered against it. Reports came back of entire units cut down, of cavalry swallowed in marshes, of infantry lines pressed flat beneath a tide of tall, fair-haired warriors whose families watched from the wagon circle as if from an amphitheater. Each defeat grew in the retelling, as commanders softened their own failures by speaking of impossible numbers, monstrous courage, and women who screamed curses from the wagons while priests lifted blades to the sky. In the Senate and in the tenements, the Cimbri and Teutones ceased to be distant migrants and became a story told in lowered voices. That story hardened into something more than rumor, something Romans would later call terror cimbricus. On every northern map unrolled in the Forum, senators imagined a dark mass of wagons and spears inching closer to the Alps, a slow storm front of people and steel. Long before Arausio, Rome had begun to fear that if this wandering world ever broke through into Italy, it would not come as a raid, but as the end of an age. In Rome, the Senate chamber buzzed under high-painted ceilings while tired men bent over maps of Gaul, tracing lines of rivers and roads that no longer felt safe. Messengers arrived with dust still on their cloaks, bringing news of legions that had vanished into northern fog and of standards that had not come home. The Republic was already worn down by the long Jugurthine struggle, by trials and feuds, by commanders recalled in disgrace. So each new report about the Cimbri and Teutones sounded less like an isolated setback and more like the drumbeat of something breaking, on wax tablets and in hurried debates. The answer formed itself in the old familiar shape of Roman confidence force. The Senate decreed that two great armies would be raised for a final reckoning in Transalpine Gaul, one entrusted to the consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, the other to the aristocratic proconsul Quintus, Servilius, Caepio. Tens of thousands of recruits were summoned. Armor was beaten back into shape, and on parchment the plan looked overwhelming, a double hammer that would crush the wandering tribes between them. Beneath the surface, though, the overlapping commands and the gulf of status between a new man and a blue-blooded veteran waited like cracks in the foundation. Seen from above, the Italian peninsula now looked less like the heart of an invincible empire and more like a house with its front door torn away. Beyond the mountains lay a victorious enemy, and between that enemy and Rome itself there stretched only scattered towns, frightened farmers, and roads too long for comfort. If these twin armies failed, there would be nothing left to hide how vulnerable the Republic really was. In the shared command of Mallius and Caepio, Rome planted its last hope against the north and the seeds of its next disaster. Two Roman commanders stood at the center of Rome's last hope in the north, and they could barely stand each other. Gnaeus Marius Maximus was a new man, a consul raised from outside the old noble clans, holding higher legal authority but carrying the stigma of humble birth like invisible armor that never quite fit. Quintus Servilius Caepio was everything Mallius was not: aristocratic, battle-tested, and utterly convinced that command was the birthright of men like him, not something granted to upstarts. In their shared tent, every decision became a tug-of-war between status and law, until cooperation was less a duty than an insult. Along the Rhône, their rivalry took physical shape in the landscape. Caepio chose his own ground and his own camp, refusing to bring his men fully into line with Mallius's forces, so that two sets of watchfires burned on opposite banks of the same river. Messengers rode back and forth under fluttering standards, but each dispatch was read less as information than as a challenge. And orders that should have bound the armies together were filed away, delayed, or quietly ignored. Beyond the Roman lines, Cimbri scouts watched the divided host with patient curiosity, learning their enemies' weaknesses without lifting a spear. By the time the great legionary eagles rose above both camps, they no longer seemed to point toward a common victory. One gilded bird looked out from Mallius's earthworks, the other from Caepio's lines, each a proud emblem turned into a rival. In the hills beyond, Cimbri eyes followed the glittering standards and understood what Rome's leaders could not yet admit before a single charge had begun. The Republic was already fighting itself across the water. At Arausio, the Rhône ran like a silver wall through the landscape, and Rome's strength lay broken along its banks before a single sword had been drawn. On one side rose the earthworks and tents of Mallius's army, crowded close to the river, while across the water Caepio's camp sat on higher, drier ground, its own ditch and rampart cutting a separate scar into the soil. Beyond both Roman lines, across open plains and low ridges, stretched the living city of the Cimbri and Teutones, tens of thousands of wagons and warriors, horses and cattle, a moving world drawn up into a ring of timber and shields that watched the river like a patient siege. Between the two divided camps, requests and refusals moved back and forth as steadily as the current. Mallius understood how exposed his position truly was, how the river that guarded his flank also trapped his men if things went wrong, and he pressed again and again for a united front, for joint camps, for a single line of battle or even negotiations from strength. Caepio, anchored in his own dignity and convinced of his superior judgment, clung to separate scouts, separate plans, and the dream of a separate triumph, treating every appeal for unity as a slight rather than a warning. In the space where a common camp should have stood, there remained only an empty strip of riverbank and the unspoken admission that pride now sat where prudence should have been. As days passed, the air between the armies thickened with more than mist and dust. Roman soldiers whispered by the campfires about earlier defeats in the north, about legions swallowed by storms and forests, while across the water they saw the glow of another Roman camp that might as well have belonged to an enemy. At night, the wind carried the deep drumbeat and harsh songs of the Cimbri host, rolling over both sets of ramparts without discrimination, reminding every listener that the tribe saw no difference between one Roman banner and another. Long before dawn on the day of battle, the board was already set, the pieces already fixed, and the true trap at Arausio lay not in the plains beyond the river, but in the stubborn distance between two Roman commanders who refused to stand side by side. Dawn came thin and cold over Arausio, and the plain beyond the Rhône slowly filled with dust as the Cimbri host stirred to life. Wagons rolled inward to lock into a defensive ring, wheels sinking into churned earth, while warriors tightened shield straps and checked spearheads in the gray half-light. Around great dark cauldrons, their priests moved like shadows, lifting their arms to a sky streaked with smoke as voices rose in harsh, rhythmic songs that carried all the way to the Roman lines. It was the kind of morning that told any seasoned commander that a decision could not be delayed much longer. For Quintus Servilius Caepio, the decision had been forming long before the first hymn to the northern gods rose over the fields. He saw not only the enemy in front of him, but the figure of Gnaeus Mallius Maximus behind, a new man whose legal rank threatened to eclipse his own laurels if negotiation or a cautious joint advance brought victory. In his mind, every hour of waiting by the river Was another hour in which Mallius might steal the glory. Or worse, sue for peace and claim that restraint had saved Rome. Better, he judged, to strike first, to show the Senate which of its commanders still carried the old Roman courage into battle. So Caepio's legions formed and moved, iron and leather creaking as thousands of legionaries tramped past their own lightly held camp and down toward the crossings. Standards dipped and rose in the pale light, trumpets cried, and the long Roman line advanced ahead of Mallius, far enough that the other army's support became theory rather than reality. Across the plain, the Cimbri shifted with steady, deliberate movements, their shield wall thickening, spears leveling, songs deepening into a single, rolling roar. When the Romans finally broke into a run, they did so with the confidence of men who had spent their lives believing that aggression alone could break any foe. The first impact shattered that belief faster than it shattered the enemy line. The Cimbri did not scatter like a mob, they absorbed the blow. Their front ranks buckling but not breaking, feet digging into the earth as the pressure of tens of thousands of bodies held firm. Roman shields slammed into a wall of wood and iron that seemed to give way for a moment, then bent and curved around them. Ranks on the flanks, folding inward like the jaws of a trap. Standards vanished inside the press, and the ordered rows of legionaries dissolved into knots of men hacked apart at arm's length. From a distance, it looked as if a great wave of Roman red had crashed against a dark cliff and then simply flowed backward and down. Gaps opened, then widened, as Cimbri warriors surged around the exposed edges of Caepio's advance, cutting off retreat, cutting down officers, turning cohorts into isolated islands of dying men. In the time it took the sun to climb a little higher above the Rhône, the proud wing that had marched out alone became a carpet of bodies and broken gear beneath a shouting, blood-splattered enemy. When the dust began to settle, one half of Rome's northern force already lay ruined on the field, and the other half still waited downstream, about to see its own fate coming toward it. From Mallius's camp, the first signs looked almost like good news. Men leaned on their shields and watched distant dust rise where Caepio's line had disappeared into the haze. And for a brief time, the smoke, the flicker of steel, and the shifting standards on the horizon could still be read as the marks of a bold Roman advance. Then standards began to fall and did not rise again. The dust thickened into a rolling brown curtain, and shapes that had once moved in straight ranks now streamed backward in broken clumps, chased by a dark, howling edge. Along the riverbank, tens of thousands of men realized in the same slow heartbeat that they were not watching a triumph, but the death of half their army. The Cimbri did not pause long to celebrate, flushed with victory and burdened with snatched banners and plunder. Their warriors wheeled like a great hunting pack, turning toward fresh prey, angling down the plain toward Mallius' position. In the Roman camp, horns blared and officers ran from tent to tent, trying to drag order out of a sea of startled soldiers. Slaves, merchants, and animals that had never expected the fight to come so quickly. Cohorts were called to form up. Lines were shouted into existence on trampled ground, and every eye that faced forward toward the oncoming mass stole glances sideways at the gap where Caepio's army had stood that morning. Behind those forming ranks, the true trap tightened. The Rhône cut like a bright blade behind the camp, leaving only a few crowded tracks and wagon-choked paths by which anyone could hope to pull back if the line broke. Baggage carts jammed together, mules brayed. Families of camp followers clutched bundles and tried to push toward any space that felt farther from the enemy, only to find more shields, more bodies, more shouted orders. As the Cimbri charge grew from a distant roar into the weight of charging feet and rattling gear, Mallius's men found themselves pressed between the river and the advancing wall of spears, edging backward step by step, already turning their heads to look at the water as the storm finally crashed into them. The Cimbri charge struck Mallius's disordered line like a hammer into unfired clay, and the legionary formations simply did not hold. What had been neat ranks and measured intervals dissolved into clumps of men pivoting, stumbling, and trying to face blows that seemed to come from every side at once. Standards that once floated above the chaos, like anchors, vanished one by one into the press, swallowed by a forest of spears and axes. Shields slipped from sweating hands. Pila were dropped, half-thrown. And discipline, drilled for years on Italian fields, ran out of the Roman army as if someone had cut a vein. The pressure of tens of thousands of bodies drove the survivors backward toward the Rhône in a single, grinding mass. Horses, mules, legionaries, and camp followers all merged into one panic crowd, funneled into narrowing spaces between wagons and baggage stacks that no plan had cleared away. At the water's edge, those in front had nowhere left to go but into the river, shoved by the weight of the terrified multitudes behind them and the relentless push of the Cimbri at their backs. Men in full armor toppled into the current, their helmets vanishing under churning foam as they clawed at one another and at the slick, collapsing banks. Across this chaos, small, terrible moments stood out like flashes of lightning. A standard-bearer held his eagle above the crush until the last possible instant, the gilded wings still visible for a heartbeat after he had disappeared beneath the surface. A line of pack animals went down screaming as they were crushed against a tangle of carts, their drivers swept away under Roman boots, their loads spilling shields and helmets into the mud. Some officers chose to die where they stood, backs to the river and swords in hand, while others turned and fought their way toward the far bank, carrying a lifetime of honor and a single instant of shame. By late afternoon, the plain and the water had become a single battlefield with no clear edge. The Rhône ran slower, clogged with floating bodies and wrecked equipment, its surface broken by shield rims, spear shafts, and pale faces turned blindly to the sky. Along the banks lay heaps of dead and dying men. Roman red and Cimbri gear mixed together so thickly that it was hard to tell where one side ended and the other began. As the sun went down behind the low hills, its light slid over a river of the dead, and the only sound that carried cleanly through the evening air was the long, exultant howl of Cimbri victory rolling back and forth across the water. Night fell over the Cimbri and Teutones' camp like a lid, and the battlefield's dust gave way to smoke as fires flared against the walls of their wagon circle. Great cauldrons stood beside rough wooden platforms, their black mouths catching the reflections of flame and steel, while warriors and families gathered in dense, shifting rings of shadow. In the center, a line of bound Roman prisoners waited under the gaze of white-robed seeress, their hands tied, their armor stripped away, the roar of battle replaced by the crackle of logs and the low murmur of chanting. The corpse-choked Rhône lay somewhere in the dark beyond. But here, victory had flowed back into ritual. According to the Roman accounts that survived, the captives were crowned with wreaths as if for a grim ceremony of honor, then lifted over broad bronze vessels while the seeresses raised knives that shone red in the firelight. Throats were cut above the cauldrons so that the blood fell cleanly, and the priestesses bent close to read futures and answers in the steam, in the pattern of drops, in the coiling shapes of entrails laid out on wooden boards. Around them, warriors hauled piled shields, captured standards, and looted gear from the field, building mounds of Roman equipment that glinted like offerings at the edge of the sacred space. In these stories, victory itself had to be paid for with blood and plunder. The defeated turned from enemies into messages carried upward to unseen northern gods, for any Roman who survived, or for those who only heard these tales later. Such rites would have seemed like a dark mirror held up to their own customs, where Rome paraded prisoners in triumphs, sold them in markets, or saved them for ransom and profit. These northern peoples were said to spend their captives in a single night, feeding them to the relationship between warriors and their gods. To Roman ears, this became one more reason to fear and despise the Cimbri and Teutones. Yet beneath the horror lay a simple, unsettling idea that in the world beyond the Alps, the richest treasure one could lay at a god's feet was not gold, but a fallen enemy. News of Arausio reached Rome not as a single shout, but as a spreading murmur of numbers that no one wanted to believe. In the forum and on the hills, families crowded around tablets listing the missing, tracing names with shaking fingers until entire streets realized that their sons, fathers, and neighbors were simply gone. Temples filled with black-clad petitioners, incense coiling uselessly towards ceilings that had seen many victories but few disasters on this scale. While priests struggled to find words for a catastrophe that had taken between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, and tens of thousands of camp followers, in a single blow. Grief lay over the city like smoke, thick and bitter, and it did not lift. In the Senate, fear took a different shape. Maps of the north now showed not a defensive line, but empty space. A naked frontier with a victorious enemy somewhere beyond the Alpine passes, and nothing left to stop them but scattered garrisons and frightened farming towns. Senators who had once spoken easily of Roman destiny now found their voices tightening as they realized that an army wiped out on the Rhône meant that Italy itself stood open in a way it had not been since the days of Hannibal. Behind the controlled gestures and formal togas, an older, simpler anxiety returned, the image of foreign spears flashing on the roads to Rome. Blame did not settle on the dead, but on the living system that had sent them there. Whispers in the streets and speeches in the Senate circled back to aristocratic arrogance, to Quintus Caepio's refusal to cooperate with a lesser-born colleague, to a republic that let rank and pride outweigh survival. Out of those fears and accusations grew what later Romans would call terror cimbricus, not just a phrase but a season of dread in which the Cimbri became less a wandering people and more a darkness at the edge of the map. In that darkness, many in Rome began to accept that the old ways had failed, and that to survive, the Republic would have to reach for a different kind of savior. Out of the fear that followed Arausio, Rome turned to a man it once might have kept at arm's length. Gaius Marius was a hard, battle-tested soldier from outside the old aristocratic families. A new man whose career had been forged in Numidia and on rough frontiers rather than in marble halls. Terror cimbricus and the ruin on the Rhône broke the Senate's confidence in its own class. And in that moment of doubt, the Republic bent its rules, granting Marius consulship after consulship because the old answers had failed. In him, Rome chose not lineage, but survival. With those powers, Marius set about remaking the very instrument that had failed at Arausio. He opened the legions more fully to poorer citizens, turning landless men into professional soldiers whose loyalty would follow paymasters and commanders as much as the Senate's decrees. Equipment was standardized, training hardened, and tens of thousands of recruits were drilled into a new kind of army, less a temporary levy and more a standing machine built to face disasters like the one on the Rhône. In time, these Marian legions met the Cimbri and Teutones at Aquae Sextiae and Versailles and destroyed them, ending the northern nightmare that had once seemed ready to roll down into Italy. Yet the shadow of Arausio did not lift, it only lengthened. The reforms born from that fear created armies bound more tightly to their generals, setting the stage for future strongmen and the civil wars that would tear the Republic apart. In later years, every Roman commander who looked north toward a new campaign carried problem. Somewhere in his thoughts, the ghost of the Rhône and the knowledge that no enemy could harm Rome as deeply as its own pride. Each time the Republic survived such hubris, it emerged a little stronger and a little more dangerous to itself.